was more like, I want to always do things that are very difficult. And when it ceases to be difficult, then that's when I find that it's time for me to do something different. And that this seemed kind of like one of the more difficult paths to go down.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening. Today I'm speaking with Matt Kuta, president and co-founder at Voyager Space, a space exploration company dedicated to building a better future for humanity in space. Matt, thanks for chatting with me today.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Well, obviously it's awesome because I've got a fellow Air Force veteran and F-15 fighter pilot, even though he flew the Strike Eagle and I was the C model, but the great communities together. And you did some amazing things in the Air Force. You got the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Jabbar Award. And so talk to me a little bit about your journey through the Air Force and then maybe how those experiences or achievements, helped shape your career post the Air Force.
So I started my time off at the Air Force Academy, and I was on the skydiving team, the Wings of Blue, and I had never flown an airplane, but I was in the back of airplanes a lot. I have, a little over 500 jumped into football stadiums and John Elway's retirement ceremony at Mile High Stadium and Fiesta Bowl and things like that. But my vision was always very bad. I was like 2,600 was my vision, something of that nature. And my junior year at the Air Force Academy, the Air Force had just approved PRK laser eye surgery and put one of the 3 locations on the campus. And they said, "Hey, do you want to get laser eye surgery?" And I said, "Sure." And they zapped my eyes for about 30 seconds a piece. And I sit up and I'm 20/10 vision and went through all the medical evaluations and waivers for the eyesight, and everything else was fine. And the next thing I know, I'm medically qualified to go to flight school. I decided to apply for that, and I got a slot there and showed up at flight school and figured, well, since I'm here, I might as well try to be a fighter pilot. I'd never flown a plane in my life. And I ended up getting selected and going down that path. And to your point, ended up flying the F-15 Strike Eagle all over the world, combat experience in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, was stationed in England for almost 4 years, did a lot of NATO type work as well. So yeah, it was a fun time.
Yeah, the Jabbar Award's pretty rare. Can you talk a little bit about mission that earned you earning that award? I mean, one a year out of the entire Air Force. It's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. So the Jabbar Award is they award it once a year to an Air Force Academy graduate of any year in the military or out of the military that has had, call it the top contribution to aviation. So a well-known recipient of it was Sully Sullenberger when he landed the plane in the Hudson River. Mm-hmm. He's an Air Force Academy graduate, and that year he was awarded the Jabbar Award. I received the Jabbar Award actually not for one specific thing. I'd say for 3 things specifically. I was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for a combat mission I flew in Afghanistan, where we helped save 41 U.S. Army soldiers on the ground. And then me and a few of my crewmates and wingmen, and one over a period of a couple days, actually helped get over 10,000 Yazidi refugees. We kind of helped provide airdrop support and help them get extracted safely out of what's called Mount Sinjar, getting them into Turkey. And then the third reason is I was able to participate and fly in the very first combat mission for the United States into Syria, and then subsequent missions. And I think the second or third one I did, we blew up 36 black market oil refineries. It was pretty exciting time, if you could say, as a fighter pilot. Particularly. So the Jabbar Award, I was kind of awarded that because of all these things. And it was sort of a very unique time that I just happened to kind of be at the right place at the right time from a fighter pilot perspective, as opposed to, me being much better than anybody else sort of a thing. So,
well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I mean, come on. No, that's awesome. And, thanks for doing that. Thank you for your service. So out of that, you've been in some unique situations, some unique skills. You transitioned out of the Air Force. What of those experiences and skills do you think have helped you become successful in your post-Air Force career?
I think a couple of things. I had the opportunity to participate in a few missions in the military that they're called no-fail missions that are presidentially directed, straight from the president. typically, Secretary of Defense or even the president will be watching this kind of thing live. And it's the kind of thing sometimes where then they'll do a national broadcast and take over the news stations and things like that. And, you're typically working with tier 1 ground units as well when you're doing some of these types of things. And those missions were the sort of thing that we were either going to win or everybody was going to die, but nobody was going to turn around. And those are, from a fighter pilot perspective, again, those are things that are very rare. Some people can go an entire career and not have those opportunities. And again, it was more of a matter of circumstances. So one of the things I've learned that I apply to civilian life, if you will, is I actually know what it likes to be willing to go all the way to the edge and know that you're just going to go until you either win or you die, right, in combat. So taking that, I'm not willing to die for a company or for Voyager Space, but I know how far I can go, and I just take 2 or 3 steps back, and that's kind of how far I'll push myself. And I think a lot of people actually think that they're working hard and they think that they are putting a strong effort, genuinely believe that, but they don't actually realize that they have significant more gas in the tank to push themselves. They just never actually had to do that. So I think particularly when you start a company from scratch as an entrepreneur, it gives you the ability to really know yourself and how far you can go. The other thing I'd say is that, and I have this mantra with my kids, I don't really care about the outcome. I tell them, how hard do you work when you drop them off at school? And they say harder than everybody else. And it's almost become in our society this weird, nasty word, like, oh, you don't want to say you're working harder than everybody else. It's a nasty word, or, competition's like, no, like I'm fine to create a culture within Voyager where the objective is to have, just like a fighter pilot squadron, where what is a fighter pilot if you remove the jet from the equation? Like, what's left? There's no machine. What is a fighter pilot? And it's a mentality. It's being surrounded by people with high integrity that are hyper competitive to be the best individually, but yet are still somehow able to come together and work together as a team to achieve some sort of common objective. So when I think through, private sector standpoint, I'm fine to have a hyper competitive team, and I want our team to, achieve objectives and to meet milestones. And I want us to be proud and celebrate, some sort of win, and do it with integrity,
Yeah, those are great lessons learned. And it is pretty unique coming from those super high tier military organizations that are, focused on mission and, bigger than themselves, and how they pitch in and just work to get it done. So I agree, that is fantastic. So after the Air Force, what led to the founding of Voyager Space? Talk us through that journey.
So I did a pit stop at business school, and then I found myself doing private equity investing at Goldman Sachs in New York City, and great period of time. I did a lot of good learning. We had an $8 billion private equity fund, very flexible mandate of different types of investments we were able to do. And, for you, as you would understand this analogy, I'd call it the weapons school of business and finance. There was 50 people on the investment team. I was one of the 50. About half were in New York City in the headquarters, and the other half were scattered between London, Hong Kong, and San Francisco. And it was a great time, because when I left the military, my thought is, I've learned a lot about leadership. I've led people in combat, learned a lot about who I am as an individual, but I wanted to kind of put all those leadership lessons in a little box for a while and package it up and stick it up in the corner of the closet and close the door and focus on nobody else but myself. And when I mean specifically myself, learning a new, very tactical skill set, which in this case was, how capital markets work, the flow of a dollar from a pension fund into a fund, into an asset, and then back out again, equity value, enterprise value, value creation, all these different things that you have zero exposure to in the military, and even in the private sector. It's very rare to get exposure at that level at a place like Goldman Sachs on the investment side. After a while, I was like, I came to the conclusion that I was a little bit older when I came in, and I wanted to learn a certain amount of stuff. And I kind of felt that I learned enough to be dangerous, if you will. Also, plus it's like dog years, because you're working like 16, 18 hours a day when you're doing that stuff. I came to the conclusion that I did not want to be just a finance guy. I wanted to be a leader who happened to understand finance. So that's when I started thinking about, okay, like maybe it's time to take that box out of the closet and pull together all the things that I'm interested in and I think that I'm, relatively good at or competent at. And you think through aerospace and defense, national security, leadership, operations, and then you add in, M&A, value creation, capital markets, and kind of wrap all that together with what I think is a mega trend, which is the space sector and kind of a long tail with the national security sector led me to create Voyager Space.
That's great. Well, it is interesting. I'd be curious your thoughts on, coming from the same community. Why are there not more that follow that same, route to get into the entrepreneurial land, to go dig that out? I find it interesting as I talk with different folks like yourself, but there are a lot that do not do that. They hang up the military cleats from being a pilot or take any, advanced, or highly functional team, from the military and choose a different path.
I'll kind of go back to the root of who I am as an individual, I'd say, is there's probably maybe two sorts of pilots. There's folks that love to fly, they love aviation. They're great, combat aviators for sure, but they're kind of people that probably got their private pilot's license when they were 16 and they went to air shows and they just love the notion of aviation. And then they got an opportunity to fly a fighter aircraft for a period of time. And then the next logical evolution is then you can go fly an airline because, you kind of aged out of the fighter pilot world. And it's a comfortable life, you make pretty good money and, get to travel around and things like that. And that's perfectly fine. But perhaps for another group of those folks, which I would put myself in and probably you as well, is to me, being a fighter pilot, like I mentioned, I kind of fell into it, right? Like I just got laser eye surgery. Like, I guess I'll go to flight school. And since I'm here, I might as well try my best. I never flown a plane. So to me, being a fighter pilot is less about being a pilot. It's more about being a warrior and your instrument happens to be in the shape of an aircraft. So the analogy I could maybe use is, like a battleship, right? A battleship is a weapon in the shape of a boat, right? A tank is like a large land-based vehicle, a large van or whatever in the shape of it's a weapon though in the shape of a tank. And to me, a fighter aircraft, it's simply a weapon in the shape of an aircraft. So when I'm no longer able to employ that weapon that coincidentally happens to have wings on it and two motors, it's time for me to kind of take that mentality and apply it to something else as opposed to flying aircraft for the sake of aviation. It was more of a mentality. So for me, choosing to go the path of going to Wall Street, choosing to start a company, I think is a combination of what I just described. It was more like I want to always do things that are very difficult. And when it ceases to be difficult, then that's when I find that it's time for me to do something different. And that this seemed kind of like one of the more difficult paths to go down.
Well, startup's definitely that. So with that, what is Voyager Space? What is your focus? And, it's an awesome company, but share with the folks on what are you guys doing out there?
So we're an operating company organized under two segments, defense and commercial. And then we have a global joint venture to build a replacement of the International Space Station as a prime contractor with Airbus and Mitsubishi Corporation. On the defense side, we have a very growing and exciting propulsion business focused on some very exciting technology that involves modulating solid state propulsion. We're on the next generation interceptor program with Lockheed Martin. And then we do custom software development for national security customers where we receive, basically raw data and we help create custom software solutions to help them identify what this data is from some sort of signal typically. On the commercial side, kind of think of two subsegments. Think of a picks and shovels business selling things and technology to different customers, software-defined radios, optical guidance navigation systems. We have over 4 million hours of space flight heritage in that subsegment. And then the last is the exploration segment within the commercial piece. We're the world's largest commercial user of the International Space Station. So we've done over 1,300 missions to the ISS.
Wow.
We've deployed over 350 satellites. We actually own our own private real estate on the ISS. It's called the Bishop Airlock. It's about the size of a large SUV. It's how you get stuff in and out of the station, satellites, trash. And it's the only privately owned real estate that's permanently integrated up there. That's, humans can go inside. Everything else is owned by a government. Because of our experience on the station as the largest commercial user, and because of the airlock and the technology, we were selected about 2.5 years ago as the prime contractor to build the entire replacement of the ISS that will be deorbited around 2030. Except right now, the ISS is owned by the government, operated by the government. It's being privatized. So the next generation, the replacements, will be privately owned by industry. And then the government will buy to use it as a service to send the astronauts and do R&D. So it's an infrastructure investment called Space Station as a Service. And we're headquartered in Denver. We have footprints in Northern California, San Diego, Reno, Nevada, Houston, Washington, D.C., and a small footprint over in Europe and Italy.
How many companies have you acquired that are now underneath your umbrella?
I would think of us as an acquisitive operating company. And in the last 4.5 years, we've acquired 7 different space companies.
Fantastic. Do you find you're going to continue to grow through that acquisition model?
If it makes sense. I mean, short answer is yes, but I wouldn't think of us as we're not just buying companies for the sake of buying companies. It's not a cash flow, aggregation sort of a thing. The way to really create value in space is more supply chain economic approach, where you can take capability A plus capability C, and now you can do some sort of joint work. You can create some operational, cost synergies, and then you unlock a higher capability that's a more valuable, asset to a customer. And the goal is to kind of be a prime capable company where now you're sitting at the top and you're dictating the supply chain and the buy versus build and the cost. And so far that's worked out well. I mean, like I mentioned, we were selected as a prime contractor to build the ISS replacement after being only around for 2.5 years, because we had kind of strategically assembled the core parts of the supply chain. The other 2 companies that were selected was Northrop Grumman and Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos' company. So That's kind of how I would think about Voyager. So, a good example is Salesforce. No one thinks of Salesforce as an acquisition machine. They think of them as a software operating company. But Salesforce has done over 75 acquisitions in its life. So I would think of us as a very acquisitive, operating company.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. That's a great model. So as you founded this, 2019, so it wasn't that long ago, what were the initial steps that maybe were the most challenging as you, got this off the ground?
When we started Voyager, we had no money, no employees, no revenue, no customers. We did have a PowerPoint presentation though, pitch deck, and that was about it. It's hard to raise money early on, right? When you have nothing but an idea. And so people are really betting on you as an individual. And so that's always difficult. There's a lot of skepticism that you're going to be able to execute on your ideas and what's the track record of this and, kind of the thing. So I think raising capital early on is very difficult. And then when you raise the capital, you, for whatever reason you're using it, then you want to demonstrate to the people that did, bet on you, and the folks that you want to maybe demonstrate competence for the next round, that you can efficiently allocate their capital and use it both operationally and financially to create some sort of value for them. So a lot of challenges with that, but it comes with the territory, I suppose, right?
Was your first step an acquisition of a company? Is that how you began, or did you start with your own team and build a product and then move forward?
So as the two founders, me and my co-founder, we started the company in August 2019, and we had 3 other folks that we brought in as contractors to help us kind of hourly buy the drink. That we kind of said, hey, listen, like, as we raise more capital, we'd like to have a conversation about maybe bringing you in as an employee. But right now we just can't afford you. So we'll pay you what we can, by the hour. And then we did acquire our first company at the end of the year. So, end of December. So about 3.5, 4 months after creating the company. So we basically had a company under exclusivity, and then we raised some capital around that, and then acquired that company. But we raised additional capital, kind of continued to build out the Voyager team. And then those 3 contractors we brought in as employees early in that year. Then we started filling up the M&A pipeline, focused on how do we grow the existing asset we had. And then COVID happened, right? So then we were like, oh, maybe this was a bad time to start a company. Eventually we got through that, and we acquired a second company as all kind of part of this roadmap, if you will, of moving up the supply chain. And they kind of, over time, the companies got larger and larger as our market cap expanded. It's very difficult to raise $100 million if your equity value of your startup is $20 million, right? You would be massively diluted. And it's not terribly respectful to the early investors or the management team. So, I call it capital structure lily pad. We did an acquisition, demonstrate operational value creation, filled up the pipeline, raised additional capital for the next company that kind of made it through the gauntlet. And then they kind of got bigger and bigger. So then when your market cap is larger, you can basically absorb, larger acquisitions essentially. And of course, the whole time, which you've already acquired, you're integrating it, at least for us, into an operating company model, as opposed to maybe some people keep them separate or something. So creating synergies across, well, do I need IT and HR and payroll and everything across all of them, or can we centralize certain things and create some margin expansion, create some innovation kind of synergies as well across the entire enterprise? So eventually it gets to the point where, you can acquire, larger, more experienced and capable, opportunities. And then of course, the whole time you're trying to grow organically, what you already, beyond just the inorganic.
What kind of challenges have you had with, establishing, maintaining, and growing culture? Because I know, I imagine culture is important to you, as you kind of mentioned.
Yeah, honestly. It's a difficult one for sure. Particularly if you've grown through a series of a few acquisitions, because presumably these companies have been around for before the acquisition, right? So I'd say we've learned that taking a slower, more kind of methodical, because we're not a private equity firm, right? So we're not trying to buy a company and grow it, put some leverage on it, and flip it and sell it within 5 to 7 years. We're taking a very long-term approach to value creation. The space sector is not going away. So, from a cultural perspective, I think, setting the cadence and the expectation at the top of the house, so that eventually kind of trickles down. Number 2 is, I think, taking a slow approach so they don't feel like you just kind of pull the rug out from underneath the folks who, are trying to learn the new culture. And I think the other thing is economics. Every company, well, not every company, but many companies have different types of incentive options, particularly as a private company. Is it an option plan? Is it phantom stock? Is there nothing at all? Is there something else? So, some of these folks, getting them aligned, particularly the key folks within the operating segments with options at the Voyager level that kind of keep them all aligned and swimming in the same direction, I think is another way.
That's got to be challenging, but it sounds like you're able to do it, which is fantastic. So as Voyager, as you look across, your technologies and service, what capabilities are directly supporting, national defense and the security needs of the U.S.?
Yeah, I'd say almost everything. Even if our customer is a commercial company, if you go like 2 or 3 levels deep, typically it's like, particularly the space sector, it's like, oh, it's the Air Force or it's the Missile Defense Agency or something, right? So I think it's most anything. The world's largest space customer is the Pentagon. NASA's very large and things like that. And, space from a national security perspective is the ultimate high ground. It's not going away. The technologies will ebb and flow, but the space as a sector specifically is not going to go away anytime soon. So whether it's the defense side, which is clearly applicable, even the commercial side, it's applicable. I'd say maybe a few areas that are not is we facilitate some research and development types of things on the ISS. So ag tech, pharmaceutical type stuff, but a lot of even the constellations on the commercial side, we're selling to commercial companies, but quite frequently the underlying customer is still some sort of national security user.
Do you have, as you look at technology changing, space is growing, what are those key enablers, or how do you see, space, working in space, delivering capabilities to space changing over the next decade?
I think space is becoming more and more mainstream than ever it was before. But I think a lot of here on Earth, here terrestrial, a lot of folks think that it's really interesting. They see it in the news, but they don't really understand how it impacts their day-to-day. So call it like the B2C customer relationship is not as obvious for many people, besides like I see a little blue dot on my iPhone, but it's kind of magic how it works. But I think if you go 3 or 4 levels deep in the either the supply chain or the data chain, space quite frequently somewhere plays in a B2B relationship, deeper in the innards of whatever the customer is seeing, and without them even realizing it. I mean, whether it's some prices that you might see when you go to the grocery store can maybe be more efficient by being able to track international shipping lines and optimize shipping of goods and services using space-based assets. Or, every stock trade on the New York Stock Exchange has a GPS time span. You saw what happened this weekend with Israel and Iran. Space was clearly very involved in that as well. So I think the more and more space becomes important, the more and more our adversaries will try to disrupt space. And when that time inevitably comes, it's going to become very obvious to citizens that space is in our daily lives without they didn't really even realize it.
And you mentioned, adversaries. What do you think are the biggest risks to your mission as you're continuing to grow this, from an adversary perspective?
When you say adversary, I'll assume you mean, foreign nations kind of a thing. Honestly, I take a little bit odd view on this. Of course, there's like the Star Wars and Star Trek of, space warfare, but I think of it more on either the cyber side, almost disrupting the flow of data from space to Earth, as opposed to, things getting blown up in space, which is, certainly, in the mix. As we know, the Chinese has shot down a satellite. An F-15 shot down a satellite in 1985 just to prove we could do it. So there is the kinetic scenario. To me, I think the cyber side is very concerning, particularly if you marry up space with some sort of space disruption with how you can maximize economic disruption. So, for example, let's say there's some sort of conflict and an adversary elects to compromise or neutralize a GPS constellation. Let's say they have that capability. Well, what does that do to global commerce if every single commercial airline cannot take off because they can't align their GPS to the tarmac, right? Like global commerce grinds to a halt. You cannot facilitate stock exchange transactions, and the US is the global reserve currency, right? So there's a lot of things that you start to think about. It's like, how can you use space to disrupt the economy?
And what steps are, that you can talk about are being taken to, help protect from the cyber, really the cyber risk, both, in space as well as within your own company? I imagine there are folks that would like a piece of what you're doing to understand.
I would think of it like, actually one of my board members is a General William Shelton. He was a former head of U.S. Space Command, and I was just talking to him last week. And I really like the way he phrased it. Instead of offense in space, calling it active defense, and how you can actively, defend our assets in space. Because, you blow something up in space, it's not like when two aircraft collided and the debris falls to the Earth in 60 seconds and it's done. Imagine every time there was a car accident, the debris from the car that broke off orbited the Earth at 5 feet above the surface at 17,000 miles an hour for 30 years. Like inevitably it's going to hit something else, right? So it doesn't really help anybody, honestly, to do that, right? So I think active defense is important. And the other thing is, I would call it, I think, the Space Force and the DoD probably calls it resiliency. I would call it diversification. So, and you're seeing a little bit of that with this drone warfare, right? You have one big fat juicy target as opposed to, hundreds or thousands of targets. It's hard to capture them all. So when you think through, space and defense, I think it's very important that the U.S. and our allies continue to focus on this very diversified thing. So, you could take out 30, 40, 50 things, but there's still this overlapping mesh of all these other ways to kind of mitigate that, as opposed to 10 big fat juicy geo satellites kind of a thing.
But you mentioned, I think that's a great point. As things blow up, space debris, I know, is an issue. How do you mitigate the risk, for your investors, for your company, of just, against things like that, and what steps can be taken to mitigate?
From a space debris perspective, if it's just simply, hey, like, how do you avoid to ensure there's not accidentally a collision? Fortunately, we're still at the stage where a lot of that stuff is able to be tracked, and there's enough space, almost like big sky theory, right? But again, big sky theory works and everything falls to the earth. Big sky theory, the sky gets very filled up much faster if nothing ever comes back out of the sky, right? But there's still space. So you can track that stuff. There's windows, and that's all very, managed. I think from a national security perspective, like, for example, the space station that we're building to replace the ISS Starlab, how do we ensure that doesn't become a big juicy target to be, targeted? Well, there's humans on board. Particularly, there's going to be Americans on board, so where NASA will send their astronauts and the European Space Agency. I'm not too concerned about it, because if the Chinese were to shoot down Starlab, which would be a disaster from a shareholder perspective, it's probably an act of war, because they've killed Americans, and many astronauts are active duty military that have been transferred to NASA. So it's almost can act as an active deterrent or a strategic deterrent, because there are, humans on board. It's a demonstration of sovereignty in space.
That's a good way to look at it. Starlab, I find it interesting. What's the difference between, from a requirement standpoint, what are you trying to do different with Starlab versus the current space station?
Well, the ISS, which is, I think, I would say the greatest feat of human engineering in the history of the world. It's an amazing thing. I mean, it's a great example of diplomacy as well, particularly between the U.S. and the Russians. But at the end of the day, it's in space, and there's radiation. It's hot, it's old, and it's getting old. The first element was put in orbit, I think, in 1998, 1996. So it's going on 25, 30 years old, and the technology inside, it was originally predicated on 1990s tech and early 2000s tech. So as that is going to be deorbited and replaced, the other thing to keep in mind, there's been other space stations. There was the Salyut station, which is a Soviet Union station, and there was a Skylab and all the there was the Mir space station, and then the ISS. So this is kind of the next evolution. What's very interesting is the ISS was built through a series of multiple launches, and then they constructed it in space and assembled the modules in space. Very technically complex, high risk kind of a thing. The CEO of our joint venture, Tim Kopra, has done two space flights as a NASA astronaut, and he helped actually assemble part of the ISS. And he was International Space Station commander for 6 months. And it's very complex, right? As a private company, I'm not generating cash flow when I'm assembling modules in space. So we're very focused on leveraging kind of the more newer technology. So we're partnered with Starship with SpaceX, which it's the new large rocket class, as an 8-meter diameter rocket fairing. So what that means is we can actually build a module that's 8 meters in diameter, as opposed to what's on the ISS, which is 4.2 meters diameter. And so 8 and 4 is, it's about 400% larger because it's volume. So it's pi r squared times L. So a single launch of our 8-meter diameter module is equivalent of about 40% of the living volume, the habitable volume of the ISS today, and 100% of the research and development volume. So in a single launch, we build a station, Starlab on Earth, we test it on Earth, we stick the entire thing in Starship and we launch it and insert it into orbit. And in a single launch, you have a usable space station, and that's it. We're not planning to put additional modules on it, although we can. So we have the power propulsion and oxygen capability where we can add additional modules. But the business model closes with a single launch sort, which also saves a lot of capital because you don't have to pay for, multiple launches.
So it's all going to go in one unit will be the entire.
Yep.
Well, that's cool. Where is that being, put together and developed?
All over the world. The Habitat, the 8-meter module is actually being done by Airbus in Bremen, Germany. And we'll float that across the Atlantic, and all the final integration will occur in Florida, and we'll launch out of Florida.
And what is your primary role, Voyager Space role in the Starlab development?
We were originally awarded the contract, so we're the prime. And then over the last year and a half, we then brought in Airbus and Mitsubishi with the joint venture. So we created a new company called Starlab Corporation. That is, Voyager is the majority shareholder. And then we have Airbus and Mitsubishi as minority shareholders. And we have an executive team and a board of directors that Jim Bridenstine is on, who's the most recent head of NASA. Mm-hmm. It's an operating company. And we have a whole team that's really running that operating company and a whole board of directors. And then Voyager, we're a shareholder of that company that we own day to day. Yeah.
So is it mandated, International Space Station, Starlab, that you went with, a Japanese company and a French company, or is that just as you worked out the best partners, that's who ended up winning?
It's a good question. So it's actually helpful to explain how the ISS works today. So the International Space Station is actually currently basically capitalized, and the core partners is actually 5 nations, okay, or like agencies, regions. NASA, which is the United States, Roscosmos, Russians, the European Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency. So if you remove the Russians for a second, Europe, Japan, and Canada represent over 90% of the current global ISS market share usage. Canada is the difference. So when I think about, those countries and regions probably want to use the replacement of the ISS, but the business model is different, right? Right now, the ISS is owned by the government. Those 5 governments really operated by the government. Well, when the ISS is deorbited, what really the replacement is, we will own it. The joint venture will own it. Our investors will own it. The government will not own Starlab. And then they will pay to use it as a service, to send their astronauts to do research and development. And then we charge some sort of, profit on that. So when you think about it, what we did is we took the business model where the foundation, like a pyramid, the foundation is the 5 government space agencies and regions, right? And then above that is the companies that might use it, right, to pay for stuff. And then you have the diplomatic partnership at the top with the European Union and Japan and US and whatnot. So all we did is we took the bottom 2 levels and we flipped it on its head. So Starlab, instead of being owned by the governments, it's owned by the marquee corporations within those countries. Mm-hmm. So when you mention Airbus as a French company, I think of Airbus as a Franco-German, the largest aerospace and defense company in Europe, publicly traded, that actually built the Columbus module that was the largest contribution by the European Space Agency to the ISS. And I think of Mitsubishi, it's the largest trading house in the country of Japan, and they built the Japanese elements that are on the ISS, and they actually have a rocket that resupplies the ISS called HTVX, which I need resupply, right? So our contract, our public-private partnership is great because we got this contract with NASA, but it's only money for America, right? And right now, the ISS is capitalized by multiple areas, primarily the Europeans and the Japanese. So it's very difficult for a foreign government agency, ESA, for example, or JAXA, to send hundreds of millions of euros across the pond to an American company and employ Americans. That money needs to stay on continent to create technology and IP and jobs in Europe. Same in Japan. So we flip it on its head so that, the governments can now work directly with Airbus to employ Europeans and create technology to spur their domestic economy in Europe. Same thing in Japan. And then Mitsubishi and Airbus can then kind of contribute that into the joint venture as their kind of contribution. So it's very deliberate in how we selected our partners. And what we're doing is effectively recreating the ISS partner nations just with the marquee corporations within those countries.
Well, that's very cool. Well, it's a neat collection of companies and capabilities, I'm sure, coming together. Just pivot a little bit. If you've got, entrepreneurs who want to start something in this aerospace or space sector, as you've done this now, what advice would you give as they venture out into this?
Couple things, I guess. One, when I flew the F-15, we had this saying, start at the target, work your way back. It would be a disaster to activate, a dozen jets, fly through enemy airspace, get to a target area, do air-to-air combat with some bad guys, and then drop a bomb on the wrong target because you missed, it was the wrong one from mission planning, and you fly all the way home and you're like, man, I got to go do all that again because I didn't know where my target was. So one thing is, I would say, figure out what your end state goal of your company is before you start the company. And what I mean by that is you don't have to know everything about what's the product market fit and you're going to pivot as you go. That's totally fine. But what I mean by that is, do you want to IPO your company? Do you want to sell your company? Do you want to run it as a lifestyle business that you sell after 30, 40 years? Do you want to run it as a family-owned and operated business that you pass down to your daughter or your son? There's all these different ways you can think. Do I want to sell it to strategic versus private equity? And then once you kind of figure out how you think you want this thing to end up, which you can always change your mind, but it's at least a good starting point, because that then trickles down to, well, how do I capitalize my company? Do I bootstrap it? Right? Because as soon as you start taking investor money, most people aren't going to want to know that they're going to give you $1 million and you're just going to hold a private company for 60 years before you give it to your son. So how are they going to get their money back with a return? And, attracting venture capital is very different than, how strategic investors look like, maybe a large publicly traded corporate venture arm of a company. So think about the target, work your way backwards. And then kind of on the topic of investors, I think, be prepared to walk away from investor money. Raising money is a difficult thing. But at the same point, one of the biggest things we see that companies have issues with as we look at, we're also, we've done some acquisitions, is they get their capital structure, misaligned incentives across share classes. They get it tied up in a Gordian knot. And next thing you know, they get to a later round of capital and either they're being so massively diluted through all these different bells and whistles and liquidation preferences that, you become an employee because you almost have no more ownership. Or number two, what's even worse is you can't even raise any additional capital because you have all these shareholders who have these different voting rights and everything. But I think try to keep a very clean capital structure, even if that means making a tough decision of walking away from some money when you think you really need it, is important. And then I think from the last standpoint, I'd say is people. There's people that are very experienced and have a lot of business, experience in whatever the particular industry is. But, there's people that are only really good at working at companies that have 150,000 plus employees or greater, right? And there are some folks that you might bring on that are rock stars, early stage, but they can't really scale beyond a company of 30 to 50 people. And they, so I think understanding who you have on your team and kind of, either growing them or being prepared to, upgrade or make a change sooner rather than later is important because people really matter, to execute the strategy.
I think that's great advice. Mason, once you get Air Force, Wall Street, and then space, fantastic. Well, I think that's all time we're going to have today. But before we wrap up, people want to, continue to watch Voyager Space, Star Lab. How's the best way to follow them or follow you?
We're on social media, obviously our website. We're on LinkedIn. There's a lot of press out there, TV interviews and stuff. So yeah, just appreciate the support.
No, that's awesome. Well, Matt, we really appreciate your time spending with us. Thanks again, and let's stay in touch.